It's my honor and privilege tonight to introduce Professor Wayne Patterson, Professor of History at State Noble College in Wisconsin. He's presently visiting Seoul, teaching in the Korea Study Program at Tonghoe University. Professor Patterson went to Swarthmore College and University of Pennsylvania, where he completed his PhD, and he was a visiting professor to many universities, including Harvard University, University of Chicago, University of Pennsylvania, as well as Hawai'i University, Korea University, and Yonsei University. He also edited or he authored or edited a number of books. The latest book, which was published last year, was the In the Service of His Korean Majesty, William Nelson Robert, The Busan Customs and Sino-Korean Relations, 1876-1888. So tonight he's going to speak on the topic of Christianity, American Missionaries, and Korean immigration to the United States, 1903 to 1915. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Wayne Patterson with a big round of applause.
Well, good evening. Thank you for coming. Can you hear okay with this?
More or less.
Big voice. A little bit louder.
Speak a little loud.
A little bit higher now?
Yeah, a little bit higher. That's okay.
What I'd like to do tonight is to talk a little bit about the role of Christianity in American missionaries and how it interacted with the first immigrants who went to the United States. Mostly they went to Hawaii. And as I'm reminded by the good folks here at the Royal Asiatic Society, I'm supposed to point out to you that in the back on the display table are several books that I've either written or edited that would touch in one way or another on some of the things I'm about to talk about tonight. Unfortunately, they're my only copies, so they're not for sale here, but I think if any of you are interested in them, you can order them through Mrs. Bay back there. I've divided my talk into several sections, 7 to be exact, and the first section deals mostly with missionary support for immigration. And in doing so, there are really 2 people I want to focus on, one in particular, and that is Horace Allen. Let's see if we can get this to work. Many of you know who Horace Allen was as the American ambassador to Korea between 1897 and 1905, but as you probably also know, he was a missionary first. And like many missionaries, Allen and the other missionaries who came to Korea started to sympathize with Korea and with the Korean people, and hoped that their own government, that is the United States government, would devote more political attention to Korea to avoid Korea being swallowed up by one of its major power surrounding countries. As you probably also know, when these missionaries went back to the United States and pleaded with the State Department to pay more attention, that these entreaties fell on deaf ears. In other words, yeah, sure, we're not going to do anything about Korea. But there was one missionary, and Horace Allen in particular, who was able to do something about it, or at least try, because he came first as a Presbyterian medical missionary, but then when he became the minister to Korea in 1897, he was now in a position to do something. And what he decided to do was to follow something which we would call today dollar diplomacy. That is, he thought that Washington would pay more attention to Korea if there were more business interests in Korea of American business interests. And so when the Hawaiian sugar planters approached him in 1902, trying to enlist his aid to get Korean laborers to come to Hawaii to offset the Japanese, who made up the majority of the sugarcane workers, Horace Allen saw yet another opportunity to invest in an American investment in Korea and hoped that that would spill over to more political interest. And so what Horace Allen did, and I can go into the details in the Q&A afterwards if you want, but essentially what he did was open the door to allow Koreans to start arriving in Hawaii beginning in January of 1903, and that lasted until 1905, when about 7,500 Koreans moved to Hawaii. Now, there was plenty of things that were going on with Korea at the time, a lot of things that you and I would call push factors that might push them out of Korea. And indeed, many Koreans had already gone off to Russia or China. But it was one thing to go to Russia or China because you could always come back to Korea in short order. It's quite another thing to go 7,000 miles away. And indeed, most Koreans didn't know where the United States was. And I'll read you some quotes that I got, not only from the immigrants themselves, but from some of the missionaries that are kind of interesting. Here's one quote that's interesting. Quote, "My father said that he did not even know where the United States was located, except that he heard that it was somewhere in the West, thousands of miles across the seas," unquote. So it was anyone's guess if the emigration franchise to the United States, particularly Hawaii, would succeed. And so it was American missionaries who helped to, I'm told to put this higher on my, yeah, I can go like this on that. Is that better? So in addition to Horace Allen, another person who helped directly to influence Koreans to go to Hawaii was George Heber Jones. And he was a Methodist missionary. Jones advised his parishioners to emigrate, telling them that the weather and the scenery in Hawaii were very agreeable, and that as Christians, they could set up a church there and evangelize. And as a result of his exhortation, more than 50 of his followers volunteered to go in the first boatload. I think I have a photo of the first group is maybe church. More missionaries, however, were spurred immigration indirectly, and they did that by giving a good impression of the United States. And the first one I'd like to talk about is one familiar to this organization, Homer Holbert, who was the editor of the Korea Review. As soon as the immigration started in 1903, he weighed in his Korea Review and cited things like compulsory education, religious opportunity, short working hours, and the opportunity to learn what he called valuable lessons, unquote. And he wrote in his journal, quote, "Those Koreans who have been in Hawaii for some time seem to be getting along very well, and their children are within reach of modern schools and advantages," unquote. Holbert also published glowing reports written by others. In one article by Reverend George Pearson, who was the Methodist missionary in Hawaii, Pearson wrote, quote, "The Koreans have received good treatment, and they are generally well pleased with their homes, advantages, and prospects," unquote. He also published something by the Presbyterian missionary S.F. Moore, and let's see if I have a photo of some of these books. There's some Holbert, here's seeing the Moore. And Moore wrote something called One Night with the Koreans in Hawaii, which was also published in the Korea Review by Holbert, that said nice things about the Koreans. Other missionaries influenced Koreans indirectly by the messages in their sermons. As one student of the Methodist missionary Henry Appenzell, the Methodist, noted, quote, to the stoic, timid Korean, the message of Christianity is one of hope and life. And it was pointed out to him in the advanced life of the United States. Was it not worth the while of any timid, downtrodden Korean laborer to make the attempt of reaching this haven of peace and plenty, unquote. Even the homes of the missionaries indirectly influenced the Koreans to emigrate to the United States. Horace Allen noted that Koreans, quote, admire the comforts of the home life of a stranger, unquote. One about to be immigrant said, quote, high above the others, those houses seem like some fairyland palaces. How calm and peaceful they look. That's Humsan, or the land of the Golden Mountain. It must be a beautiful country, indeed, and a big, strong, and rich country, unquote. Koreans were also impressed by, and thus became familiar with, Western dress. One said, quote, all this time, Ma Moksun Im, that's Reverend Samuel Moffat, was being observed, and I observed how he was dressed. If I could not be an American born like him, at least I could dress like him and preach like him, I thought. Yes, I wish that I could go to Migo someday and come back as a missionary to my native country, unquote. Let's see if I can show you. The same is true for mission schools. Moffat's Sumshil School in Pyongyang was one that taught new things like geography, arithmetic, and many other new things. Finally, let me mention Koreans were treated by missionary doctors using Western medicine, and this also increased the admiration of America. One young man who was about to emigrate was cured of an eye infection by Dr. Wells. Here's what he said, quote, I wanted to become a doctor like Dr. Wells, Presbyterian. My father said that there was no doctor school in the country that he knew of. To learn to be a doctor, he said, the only place to go was the place where the doctor had come from, which was Migu, unquote. In sum, Koreans who had interacted with missionaries had become familiar with the English language, with the religion of the United States, Christianity, with Western dress, Western houses, Western medicine, a Western curriculum, and life in America to a certain degree. It should be no surprise then that Koreans who had experienced these would be more likely to emigrate to America than those Koreans who had not. But not all American missionaries supported immigration to the United States. Most of the opposition centered around the Presbyterian missionaries in Pyongyang. One of them was Reverend Moffat himself. And one of the opposition reasons was that the Koreans were unwitting participants in the violation of the U.S. immigration laws against contract labor. And that, in fact, was true, because what was happening was that the sugar planters in Hawaii were illegally paying passage of the Korean workers by laundering the money through the bank set up by the recruiter named David Deschler, you'll see later on, and also signing them to work agreements before they even left Korea. Both of these things were illegal under U.S. immigration law. When Moffat raised this objection, Horace Allen sprang into action. He enlisted Homer Holbert to carry an article regarding, quote, the mistaken impression on the part of a few of the foreign residents in Korea, meaning Holbert, that the work in sending Koreans to work in the sugar fields of Hawaii is contrary to the U.S. law, unquote. The second reason that Moffat and some of the others in Pyongyang argued against immigration was that, quote, they would be liable to suffer ill usage or be demoralized, unquote. Once again, Allen explained in action, quote, the move on their part, meaning the Koreans, seemed to be one that you of all men would be glad to encourage, talking about Moffat. The chief men of the islands are Christians, sons of missionaries, and the Sabbath is kept and church-going is encouraged, unquote. Moreover, Allen said, quote, as the movement is one that seems to be desired by our own people and most beneficial in every way for the Koreans, I ask you to withhold judgment until you are better informed. Unquote. The third complaint that was made by the Pyongyang missionaries was based on jurisdictional disputes. At the quote, we have no work in Hawaii, the Presbyterians. The result is likely to be a transfer of their allegiance to the Methodist Church, and we ought not to lose them, unquote. But the fourth and the main reason for their opposition was the fact that emigration took promising young men away from Christian work in Korea. Here's what Reverend William Baird said. Quote, in a country as wretchedly ruled as this, there is beginning to be a desire to get out of it. And that's not to be wondered at, unquote. The sugar plantations of Hawaii, quote, are not the best place for the development of Korean Christians. And the only hope for their country is for those who are Christians to stay here and help to overcome the wrongs here, unquote. Baird went on to criticize other missionaries, both in Korea and the United States, for encouraging emigration. In fact, in one case, he cited a letter written to students in Korea by a Korean who had already gone to San Francisco, inviting them to leave and giving them the impression that they would be able to support themselves by work furnished by Christian schools. The result of that letter, claimed Baird, quote, was to discredit all I had said to the pupils against their going to America, unquote. To prevent an exodus, Baird recommended against a, quote, unwise expenditure of benevolence, quote, on the part of the missionaries that are putting irresistible temptations, unquote, in front of the Korean young men and, quote, filling with discontent and restless longings the minds of many. Another one, Sally Swallen, also in Pyongyang, said, quote, we can't blame them for wanting to go to America, and yet we do not encourage their going. Instead, we would rather the Christian people would remain here and do what they can. Let's see if I have another image here of Sally Swallen. More than a year later, the Pyongyang Presbyterians were still complaining. William Baird wrote, quote, we were very much deplored their going because they were promising boys of some Christian experience, and we needed them here, unquote. They were needed as teachers, quote, especially since we find it hard to get a sufficient force of foreign teachers, and native men could do invaluable work. Another one was Reverend Charles Bernheiser, who decried the influence of a Christian evangelist whose, quote, influence has been very detrimental to this group, where he should have spent a good deal of time preaching to the heathen, unquote. That's not Bernheiser, but that's one of the fellows I'm about to talk about now. The Presbyterian missionaries in Pyongyang eventually reconciled themselves to the fact that Koreans would continue to go to the United States. Consequently, they abandoned their overt opposition as ineffectual and did the next best thing by eliciting promises from the intending immigrants that they would eventually return to Korea. So one immigrant who was about to leave, Mr. Shaw here, whose autobiography is in the back, here's what he said to Moffat. Quote, I didn't forget to say goodbye to Reverend Moffat, who baptized me. When I went over to his home that evening and told him I was on my way to America, he said, oh, how nice. Yes, sir. I'm glad. And when I told him that I intended to learn to be a doctor and return as a medical missionary from America, he was delighted and said, that's just fine. We need more doctors, especially Korean doctors for the Korean people. May God bless you and keep you until you return as a Christian doctor. Few, however, would return and keep their promises to return to Korea. In short, despite the opposition of missionaries, Presbyterian missionaries in Pyongyang, immigration to Hawaii remains possible. The recruiter, David Deshler himself, wrote that immigration to Hawaii, quote, had the approval of the majority of the missionaries, unquote. The next section is about the linkage between Christianity and immigration. And let me start out by saying that not all the immigrants were Christians, but the evidence suggests that the great majority had had some contact with Christian missionaries. And in fact, the cohort of immigrants closely resembled the cohort of those who were attracted to Christianity. That is, both were overwhelmingly younger rather than older, more likely to be urban dwellers rather than rural dwellers, more likely to be unemployed or employed in urban-type jobs than in farming, and often more likely to be recent migrants to the cities after being uprooted from their ancestral homes in the countryside by some combination of war, rebellion, famine, drought, disease, oppressive taxes, corrupt officials, poverty, or banditry. Because most American missionaries were based in the cities, they attracted these young, urban, rootless males on the margins of society who were open to any opportunity that presented itself, either the new religion of Christianity or immigration to the United States, or both. Although there is a strong correlation between the two, it would not be correct to say that religion was the main reason for their decision to emigrate. Rather, the main reason was a combination of bleak prospects in Korea combined with good reports of life and work in the United States. That is, Christianity functioned as an intervening variable, making the decision to leave easier because those Koreans were more familiar with Americans and American culture through their association, however tenuous, with American missionaries. That is, if a Korean were Christian, it increased the likelihood that they would choose to emigrate. Aware of the close connection between Christianity, American missionaries, and the desire and willingness to go to America, David Deshler, who was the recruiter, wisely selected Korean Christians to assist him in the recruitment effort. And since most of the likely immigrants were being found where the missionaries themselves were located, Deshler located his dozen or so recruiting offices, the Tonghoe Cable Plaza, East West Development Company in the cities. Take another picture of David Deshler here. Deshler's in the white jacket there. He's in Hawk Salad to the right. So he was a recruiter for the Koreans. Now I'd like to switch the scene a little bit from Korea to the United States. There are now 7,500 Koreans in Hawaii by 1905. And the Japanese had managed to bring an end to Korean immigration in the summer of 1905. But the Korean government decided that, since Korea was still an independent country, that it had the right to send people wherever it wanted. They knew that they had to clean up their immigration business, which the Japanese had used successfully to bring it to a halt. So in the summer of 1905, the foreign minister of Korea, Lee Ha-young, decided to send his deputy was Yoon Chi-ho, to go to Hawaii to go on an inspection tour. And if everything was right, he would come back to Korea and write up rules and regulations to supervise immigration. When Yoon Chi-ho arrived in Hawaii in August of 1905, he went to every plantation where there were Koreans, and he was accompanied by the Methodist Reverend John Wadman, who had succeeded Pearson the previous year. At these plantations, both Yoon and Wadman found that the Koreans, being mostly single young men, exhibited behavior typical of many young men away from the constraining influences of their elders and traditional mores: drinking, gambling, swearing, fighting, and committing sexual assault. As Wadman observed, quote, "The Koreans are in a very needy condition, and fearfully immoral influences prevail among them. Gambling and drinking are common practices. Their reputation is very bad indeed." Yoon and Wadman saw Christianity as the solution to this moral breakdown. A logical conclusion, given Wadman's position and Yoon's own Christian views, owned by his Methodist seminary training at Vanderbilt University and Emory University. As Yoon said, Koreans who were Christians were more content, better behaved, and law-abiding. But Yoon only spent a month in Hawaii before returning to Korea. Consequently, it fell to the Koreans themselves to police their plantation-based communities. And it was Christian principles that contributed to this policing. Let's see if I have a picture of Michio. I have a picture here of Chung Soon, who was one of the people who Deshler recruited Christian. That's Chung Soon here, who helped to recruit the immigrants to Hawaii. In these plantation communities, the few married women and their teenage daughters invariably face the risk of sexual assault. One interviewer noted, quote, "Most Koreans were young and unfamiliar with cultured life. It was in need of protecting the 600 families. Drunkenness and unruly manners among these unmarried Koreans had to be defended against. Koreans were ignorant and made many problems for women." The 19-year-old woman remembered her parents telling her, quote, "Because I was a teenager, I was told to stay away from the bad plantation workers," unquote. Consequently, Koreans on the plantation spontaneously developed organizations known as tonghoe, or village councils, that were based at least in part on Christian principles. The leaders were invariably some combination of Christians, those few with families, and or those few who had been farmers in Korea. These tonghoe drew up rules and regulations outlawing the kind of behavior that most Christians would oppose: drinking, swearing, gambling, fighting, illicit sexual relations, and sexual assault. Penalties included warnings, fines, floggings, being placed in stocks, and banishment. As a result of these tonghoe, that's one Soon, who you just saw noted, the morale of Korean villages became better gradually, unquote. The tonghoe also made certain plantations more attractive to Christian families, Christian Koreans with families. Quote, "The news about our self-ruling Kahuku Korean camp was spread all over Hawaii. Many married Koreans came to the Kahuku camp. The outstanding persons I still remember were mostly Christian families in Pyongyang," unquote. In short, although the tonghoe were not in and of themselves overtly Christian organizations, they did promote many aspects of Christian probity. Let me turn now to Korean churches and pastors on the plantations. In addition to the tonghoe, a second aspect of Christianity was the formation of Korean Christian churches, initially organized by Koreans themselves. The first one was organized less than 6 months after the arrival of the first Koreans. Services were held in the boarding house kitchens, and the pastors were plantation workers who had had some missionary training in Korea. This initiative elicited a favorable response from a few of the plantation managers. For example, the Koreans on Eva Plantation collected $300 and requested that the manager build a church. The manager was greatly pleased and said, quote, "They were better than he because they believed in God firmly, even though they were laborers on the floor." As a result, he donated $750 to build a church and used the $300 collected by the Koreans to furnish it. As these churches sprang up more or less spontaneously, the Methodist Missionary establishment deemed it necessary to bring them under its authority. In 1905, Reverend Wadman, quote, makes frequent trips throughout the islands, visiting the Koreans and looking after their religious and educational interests. He has enrolled over 1,600 men and women on the records of the church. Wadman also organized a cohort of Korean Methodist ministers, some of whom were attached to particular plantations, while others itinerated along several plantations. These ministers also act as mediators. As one remembered, quote, besides preaching, I used to help the welfare of the Koreans and straighten out misunderstandings between the Korean workers and the plantation officers, unquote. On occasion, some of these pastors were subsidized by individual plantation managers. His ad hoc construction of Korean chapels and provision of salaries for Korean pastors did not go unnoticed by Wadman. Because these pastors engaged in preaching, converting, teaching, interpreting, and mediating, Wadman believed that he could persuade the planters in a systematic approach to support his mission work among the Koreans financially. Now, the sugar planters had two major complaints about the Koreans. First was that they were poor agricultural workers, and that's not surprising because they were from the cities, and thus they were not useful as an offset to the Japanese. The second was that the Koreans were increasingly unstable by engaging in plantation hopping, or worse, moving to the city. Now, the planters had already been told by Yoon Chi-ho, the Christian Koreans made better plantation workers, and it would make them more stable. Wadman now argued that his Korean pastors could make the Koreans work harder and keep them on the plantation. Specifically, what Wadman wanted them to do was build chapels for the Koreans and pay the salaries of the Korean pastors. In return, he had to promise that the Koreans would be better workers. Here's what he said to one. I will have Reverend Mr. Kim visit your plantation once or twice a week so as to try and get these men to do better work and help. To another manager, Wadman wrote, our little church is established and a faithful pastor resides with his school and night classes, besides the Sunday services. A better class of people is raised up. A more healthy moral atmosphere prevails. It really pays. He also wrote to another one, quote, these little chapels which we have been building greatly help the Koreans in one place, and so in the end it plays plantation. In general, Wadman was successful in his efforts to have the plantation owners erect chapels and subsidize the pastor's salary. Although these efforts increased the Christian orientation of the Korean community, they did little to improve the work habits of Koreans and keep them on the plantation. In fact, the Koreans reported the fastest departure rate from the plantations of the 32 different ethnic groups in Hawaii's history. Consequently, plantation managers became increasingly unwilling to contribute to pastor's salary. Here's what one wrote. Mr. Wadman made promises which he has not lived up to, and in the writer's opinion, the monthly donation should be discontinued. In 1914, Wadman was succeeded by yet another Methodist minister, William Henry Fry, who said he could get the Koreans to come back to the plantations from the city. But this fell on deaf ears. This is what one plantation manager said. I am in receipt of your letter of the 18th with reference to placing your Korean pastor, Reverend Cho, on our payroll at $18 a month. I regret to have to inform you that I do not see any way to grant your request. At the present time, we have only one Korean on our payroll. Here's a photograph of Yoon Chi-ho. There's one right here. My final section is on Christianity and factionalism. And I stopped this talk in 1915 before the one that you're probably most familiar with, the one between Sigmund Rhee on the one hand and his Korean Christian church, and the Hwee, Korean Methodist church. But I'm going to talk about the first one, which is less well known. When the Koreans came to Hawaii, they, as the Presbyterians in Pyongyang were afraid of, became mostly Methodists. And that means the Methodists were in charge of just about every organization that was founded among the Koreans in Hawaii. The most notable of which was one called the Missionary, the Jew People's Society, started in 1903. It was a political society. Its leader was a Methodist by the name of Paul, who collaborated closely with Reverend Patterson, and its program called for reform of the home government in Korea. But not every Korean who joined this organization agreed with the agenda of the Shinmin-Hui or the monopoly of the Methodist leadership. And a more conservative faction of that society arose against the more radical Methodist leadership, charging that they were traitors to Korea. And they called the Shinmin-Hui the Yukchuk-Hui, or Traitors Society. This opposition faction was upset by the Methodist monopoly and leadership roles and decided to go to another church to align itself with, specifically the small Episcopalian group in Hawaii. Here's what the Episcopalian bishop said. Quote, "A number of Koreans, mostly non-Christian, came to me in the summer of 1905 and asked me to minister to them." Quote, "You may have had an inkling that they had come to him for political rather than religious reasons because he observed that Koreans, quote, are not an easy people to deal with, as they are divided into factions which quarrel and sometimes come to blows." Unquote. As a result of this factionalism, the Shinmin-Hui disintegrated, and its leader, Mr. Hong, Reverend Hong, returned to Korea and resurrected the Shinmin-Hui in 1907 with Tosan Anshan in Korea. So this is where the name Shinmin-Hui comes from. So just let me conclude by saying, in sum, the Christianity and American missionaries were intimately involved in both the immigration process in Korea, as well as the formation of a Korean community in Hawaii during the early decades of the 20th century. And let me just conclude by showing you a few images of some of the churches that were found mostly in Hawaii, but also on the mainland. This is the Episcopal bishop that the minority faction of the Shinmin-Hui went to. Bishop Bruce. So here's the tonghoe Korean Methodist Church. It's in Hawaii, suburb of Honolulu. Another church, also a suburb of Honolulu. These are all plantations. Hawai'i, the island of Hawaii, the Methodist Church. Big island of Hawaii, that's a good island. Valley. He lived to be 100 years old. Right here. Here's London, and London. And here's San Francisco. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Professor Patterson can entertain a few questions. Anybody has any questions?
There's no mention about Catholic involvement here.
And the reason for that is that there were no Catholics to speak of in Honolulu.
I mean, the recruiting in Korea or the influencing the immigration itself, Catholics had nothing to do with that, I guess.
I've come across no reference to Catholics. Back in those days, there was some conflict between Catholics and Protestants, and the most egregious example of that was a guy named William Franklin Sands, who was a Catholic who worked for the Korean government. But every document that I've seen has indicated that it was Protestant missionaries who were involved. Mostly Presbyterians, Missionary Christians. Yes?
Tell us about where the women came.
Well, the women who came between 1903 and 1905 came almost invariably as wives of the men, or as daughters in families. And I think I mentioned there were about 600 families. But 85, 90% of the people who came between 1903 and 1905 were single men. So what I think you're maybe referring to is the picture bride phenomenon, which I didn't get a chance to talk about, which began in 1909 and continued in 1924. And in fact, chapter 4 of my book back there called The Ill State is all, chapter 6, is all about the picture brides. And it's a fascinating story. Maybe next time I'll do that story for you. But, the men would get their picture taken in Hawaii and send them off to Korea. Very interesting process because they go to the photographer's studio and get their photographs taken. Of course, being mostly plantation workers, they had dark suntans, so they put the talc on their face so they look like high-class office workers and professionals, something like that. They'd wear a tuxedo so they look rich. And sometimes they'd have a picture taken with a Model T Ford with their foot up on the running board like this. So this is my car and the manager's house. In the background, this is my house, to get the young ladies to come and see them. They'd also have to get up anywhere from $200 to $800 to get the women here, but include not only boat fare, but also traveling expenses and enough money to demonstrate that they made a success of themselves. Of course, they couldn't go to the Bishop Bank in Honolulu and ask for a loan to bring a picture bride in, so they used something called a GAG, which is kind of a rotating credit group. You get 10 of your close friends, and they each kick in $25, and you say, I'll pay you back in 2 years, and $30 so I can get a picture with you. So we estimate that about 1,000 picture brides came to Hawaii between 1909 and 1924 as a result of this process. Fascinating story. And they were mostly Christians.
I recall that Sigmund Rhee stopped in Hawaii in 1905, and Reverend Yun Young-Gu and Sigmund Rhee went to New York and visited Abe Roosevelt.
Tried to visit
in Oyster Bay. or ceremony. This symbolic plays a role in Hawaii. I also learned of Pagyoman, started like a military training station, and they've been rival. There's a strong rivalry between Sigmundri and Pagyoman, even though they served prison term together previously.
You remember Reverend Wadman, who I was talking about, right?
Louder, please.
Yes, sir. Okay. The question was about Sigmund Reed and his relationship with Pagyoman. This is much better, isn't it? In 1914, there was a falling out between Reverend Wadman, and the Korean community. And Sigmund Reed had a lot to do with that. And that's why Wadman resigned in 1914 and was replaced by Reverend Fry, another Methodist missionary. There were two reasons. One was, the Methodist Church is a national organization, so when the collection plate would go around, you put money into the collection plate, but the money goes to Cranberry, New Jersey, which is where the Methodists are headquartered. And Sigmund Reed said, it's not fair. We Koreans, we work on the plantation, we don't make much money. That money, that Korean money, should stay here in Hawaii to help Koreans. It shouldn't be sent to New Jersey to who knows what will happen to them. So this is one thing that there was a disagreement between Reed and Reverend Wadman, who, of course, represented the Methodist Church. The other thing that caused the split was Wadman set up a Korean benevolent society and to help indigent Koreans, which, of course, is a perfectly natural thing to do. And it turned out that the Japanese consul in Honolulu, who thought that now that Korea is part of Japan, he's in charge of the Koreans, he donated $500 to Wadman for the Korean Benevolent Society. And word of this leaked out to the Koreans. And so the Koreans said, what? You took money from the Japanese? We're not under the Japanese, we're Koreans. We came here on Korean passports. And so there was a split. Reed led his followers away from the Methodist Church, away from Wadman, and founded the Korean Christian Church, which in terms of services and liturgy is no different from the Methodist Church. But by the late teens, you have a split in the Korean community. You have two different organizations, the Gumminhwa, the Korean National Association, led by Pagyoman, and the Dongjihwa, or the Comrade Society, led by Sigmund Reed. You have two different churches, the Korean Methodist Church and the Korean Christian Church. You have two different separate newspapers, the the Gumminhwa's newspaper, and the Taekwondo Chugo, Sigmund Reed's newspaper. So different organizations fighting each other, different leaders, Pop versus Reed, different churches, different newspapers. And this split, despite some brief coming together after the March 1st movement in 1919, and briefly again in 1942, was going to characterize the split in the Korean community. I didn't talk about it because if I'd done that, it would have kept me going for hours and hours. So that's why I stopped in 1915.
Is that a Japanese flag next to the Korean flag?
I'm not sure what that is.
Sure looks like it.
I hope not. I can't imagine.
What is?
I'm not sure what it is. Doesn't look like the Hino Maru.
something else at stake in was there something else at stake in sending these Christians to Hawaii? Were any of the missionaries benefiting in any way? Do you find any evidence, or do you even speculate? You didn't find any evidence of what was at stake here, more politically or economically?
I found, let me take your second question first. I found no evidence that any of the missionaries benefited in any way, either monetarily or I'm not quite sure how else they might benefit. The only benefits would be maybe some of the families who did go to Hawaii who benefited from remittances that were sent back by the workers. But your other question is interesting, and we don't have good statistics, as you can probably guess, around 1902 or 3. We estimate that there were about 100,000 Christians in Korea out of a total of about 8 to 10 million Koreans as a total population. So a very minute number. And yet, the evidence suggests that many of the immigrants, not all of them, but many of them had some interaction with the American missionaries. And we know that because the cohorts were the same, the locations were the same, et cetera, et cetera. And when they got to Hawaii, of course, they all were Protestant Christians for the most part. There were a few Buddhists and that sort of thing. But I can't, if you talk about, you could say, well, if you're looking for statistics, you've got 7,500 Koreans out of 100,000 Christians. If all of them are Christians, what's 1 out of 100 or something like that, then I'd hate to go out on a limb like that and give you a statistic that would be as much guesswork as anything else. So.
Yeah, now let me get straight that this was based out of Pyongyang, right?
The opposition was.
Well, I mean, okay, but I mean the original immigrants were from Pyongyang.
No, they're from Seoul in China.
Okay. And picture brides, they were also from the same region?
No, picture brides came mostly from Kansai Mando, for reasons that are not fully explainable.
Did that create any sort of sense of regionalism inside of Hawaii, and that transpired to form who became a Presbyterian and became a Methodist? And the final observation about the Kino model, I think what we have up there is you just have the Korean flag pinned on one side, and instead it's meant to be showing the Korean flag viewed from 2 different angles, 2 different sides. So maybe seeing is not the Kino model, but just the back side of the Korean flag that faces opposite direction.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's the question.
Sure. David Deshler, the recruiter, had about a dozen recruiting offices, and they were scattered throughout all Korea, mostly in port cities. And to that meant Koreans came, although the original folks came from the church of George Hubert Jones, eventually they came from all over Korea. And in terms of factionalism, it's kind of interesting because one of the things, and I did talk about this, the tonghoe were not the only organizations on the sugar plantations. There was another set of organizations called Sworn Brotherhoods. And the Sworn Brotherhoods were initially set up to protect Koreans from Japanese. There were a lot more Japanese than there were Koreans. And the evidence suggests that, especially after 1905, some Japanese plantation workers would walk around like, yeah, we took over your country, you guys are losers, that sort of thing. And so fights would break out. Or sometimes the Korean women didn't appreciate the fact that when the Japanese men were going to the flow, they'd be going to the Korean camp with just a little cloth in front of their loins, right? And that was And so there would be fights between the Japanese and the Koreans, and so these sworn brotherhoods were set up to protect Koreans mostly from Japanese. But what happened was, in terms of factionalism, was that there were these different sworn brotherhoods, and they distinguished themselves based on ink marks on their shoulder. And if you think about it, this is like the modern day version of club colors, right? These are gang insignia, right? In fact, that's exactly what happened, that these sworn brotherhoods tended to segregate themselves based on where they came from in Korea, and they ended up, instead of fighting the Japanese as they were originally supposed to do, ended up fighting each other. And so, as a matter of fact, the tonghoe, which were set up to keep law and order, actually found themselves having to deal with gang fights between sworn brotherhoods based on regional affiliation. When the women came, and as I said, they mostly came from southeastern Korea, they of course married people who would come, men that would come from all over Korea. The only thing that was regional in their existence was they founded an organization known as the Yongnam-Puing-Hue, the Southeastern Korean Wives Association, which largely did charity work and promoted nationalist causes. And what's interesting about these women was they all came during the Japanese colonial period, whereas the men had all arrived before the Japanese had taken over. So the women could cite chapter and verse about what the Japanese were doing in Korea that the men had only heard about. They had never experienced Japanese depredations themselves.
But this division break into church alignment instead of?
Church alignments?
Yeah.
I haven't gone into, there was one thing, when I wrote the book, I had to leave a lot of stuff out. One of the things I left out was that I only have 1 or 2 chapters on the nationalist movement per se. So I don't know if, like, Syngman Rhee's faction was populated by people from Gyeongsang and Pakistan was someplace. I don't know that.
You said the tank is going to display markings on their brows. Was it in tattoos? And if so, was there any particular symbolism that these groups sort of used?
I don't think they were tattoos. They were just ink dots. So 1 or 2 or 3 ink dots would determine which sworn brotherhood you were a member of. I have not seen a photograph of this. Sure. Yes, again.
I don't want to keep belaboring the issue, but you seem to be pointing to this interesting relationship between Christianity and capitalism. I'm not sure if that's, I mean, in terms of the churches as this way of disciplining worker, or, you know, I think you spoke about that a little bit. I don't know if you talk about that in your book, or you can expand a little bit on what you think that relationship is.
The sugar planters brought in the Koreans because they had figured out long ago that it's not a good idea to have one race on the sugar plantations. It's always a good idea to mix the races, to offset or to play one race against another. And, for example, when the Japanese went on strike, and they did so on 2 separate occasions, territory-wide. One was in 1909, one was in 1920. And when the Japanese went on strike, the first people who came back to be strikebreakers were, you guessed it, the Koreans. Now, why did they come back? Well, 2 reasons. One, if you're a strikebreaker you get paid 2 or 3 times the normal wages. So if the normal wage is $1 a day, you as a Korean make $2 or $3 a day as a strike breaker. So if you have already left the plantation, then actually it might make sense, depending on what you're doing, to come back and be a strike breaker. Trouble is, of course, when the strike is over, when you've broken the strike, the wages go back to $1 a day, and therefore the Koreans go off again. But the other reason is that the Koreans want to break the strikes because anything that the Japanese are for, the Koreans are going to be against. Okay? So for nationalistic reasons. I have the transcript of a meeting of the Gumminhui, which is kind of interesting because, you know, when we talk about capitalism and class solidarity and that sort of thing, the leaders of the Gumminhui, I think this was the strike of 1920, said to the Koreans, you know, we should support the Japanese because if they win the strike, all of our wages will go up and we'll all be better off. And the neighbors had to call the police because this resulted in a fight between the leadership that wanted class solidarity with the rank and file who wanted to oppose the Japanese. And so they said, we don't care. The phrase is, we are opposed to the Japanese and everything. And so the leadership was hooted off the stage, and the Koreans were strike breakers. So there was no Pan-Asianism here. There was no class solidarity. And so the planners, the only thing that the planners wished was, you know, these Koreans, if we had more of them and they were better workers, they'd be a perfect offset. But right now we can use them as strike breakers to break the Japanese strikes. And they did. They broke both strikes, 1909 and 1912. I'm not sure if that gets into the Christianity angle, but certainly the nationalist angle gets into it. And of course, a lot of these meetings were held in churches.
Okay. So, thank you very much.